Long before the Silk Road connected distant empires, before the Great Wall stretched across Chinese mountains, before Roman legions marched through European forests, there flourished across the Indian subcontinent a tapestry of civilizations whose spiritual and intellectual achievements would reshape human understanding of existence itself. This vast land, bounded by the Himalayas to the north and endless ocean to the south, became the birthplace of profound philosophies, revolutionary mathematical concepts, and religious traditions that would spread across continents. The monsoon rains, arriving with seasonal certainty, yet varying in intensity, shaped not only agriculture, but the rhythms of contemplation. In the quiet months between harvests, thinkers retreated to forest ashrams and mountain caves, developing ideas about consciousness, suffering, and liberation that would echo through millennia. Here, mathematical concepts that would transform human calculation took form. Surgical techniques were refined to remarkable precision, and the very nature of reality was questioned with unprecedented depth. This story unfolds across 4,000 years, from the earliest cities that flourished along the Indus River around 2600 BCE to the medieval kingdoms that ruled the southern seas. Merchants carried Indian spices and ideas to distant shores, while philosophers debated the nature of the soul in forest clearings. Kings built temples that reached toward heaven, while astronomers calculated the movements of celestial bodies with extraordinary precision. The geography itself invited contemplation. The subcontinent's diversity, from the fertile Gangetic plains to the arid Deccan Plateau, from coastal trading ports to mountain meditation retreats, created conditions where multiple traditions could develop simultaneously. Unlike civilizations constrained by narrow river valleys or isolated by deserts, India's varied landscapes fostered a civilization of remarkable intellectual and spiritual diversity. The great rivers themselves tell this story. The Indus, flowing through the northwest, nurtured humanity's first carefully planned cities. The Ganges, sacred to millions, witnessed the birth of philosophies that would question the very nature of existence. The southern rivers, flowing eastward to the Bay of Bengal and westward to the Arabian Sea, carried the wealth that would build maritime empires and fund the construction of temples whose mathematical precision still inspire wonder. Our journey begins in the mysterious cities of the Indus Valley, where sophisticated urban planning and undeciphered script hint at achievements we are still discovering. We follow the development of Vedic traditions that would preserve humanity's oldest continuously chanted poetry. We witness the revolutionary insights of the Buddha and Mahavira, whose questions about suffering and liberation would influence billions. We explore the administrative genius of the Mauryan Empire and the cultural flowering of the Gupta age. Finally, we trace the establishment of regional kingdoms whose temples and treatises would preserve ancient wisdom while adapting to new challenges. The patterns that emerge from this long history reveal humanity's persistent quest for meaning, beauty, and transcendence. From the geometric precision of Harappan city planning to the mathematical elegance of classical Indian astronomy, from the philosophical rigor of ancient debates to the artistic refinement of medieval temples, each generation built upon the achievements of those who came before while adding their own distinctive contributions. This is not merely a chronicle of political rises and falls, though kingdoms certainly rose and fell with regularity. Rather, it represents the deeper story of how human consciousness developed tools for understanding itself and its place in the cosmos. The insights preserved in Sanskrit texts, the architectural principles embodied in stone temples, the mathematical theorems recorded on palm leaf manuscripts, the musical systems that still guide contemporary performance. All these represent humanity's ongoing experiment in creating meaning and beauty amid the challenges of existence. As we prepare to explore this vast sweep of history, we find ourselves following paths traced by countless feet over many centuries. Pilgrims journeying to sacred sites, merchants traveling trade routes, scholars moving between centers of learning, armies marching to distant campaigns, all contributed to the complex web of cultural exchange and development that created the civilization we are about to discover. In the northwestern reaches of the subcontinent, where the monsoon rains gave way to the snow-fed rivers descending from distant mountains, there emerged around 2600 BCE a civilization whose sophistication continues to challenge our understanding of early human achievement. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, discovered only in the 20th century beneath centuries of accumulated soil, revealed urban planning so advanced and uniform that their equal would not be seen again for over a millennium. These settlements displayed a remarkable consistency of design across hundreds of miles, streets laid out in perfect grids oriented to catch the prevailing winds that would carry away the heat of summer days. Houses built to standardized dimensions as if following architectural plans that had been carefully thought through and widely distributed. Most remarkably, sophisticated drainage systems channeled wastewater through covered sewers beneath the streets, a level of civic planning that suggests profound concern for public health and communal well-being. Walking through the excavated remains of Mohenjo-Daro today, one can still sense the careful thought that went into every aspect of urban design. The lower city, where most people lived and worked, was laid out with mathematical precision. Streets running north to south intersected at right angles with those running east to west, creating city blocks of uniform size. The main thoroughfares were wide enough for carts to pass each other comfortably, while narrower lanes provided access to residential areas. Every house contained a private well and bathing area, suggesting that personal cleanliness was not a luxury but a standard expectation of urban life. The sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering required to provide fresh water to thousands of residents while simultaneously removing wastewater demonstrates technical knowledge that would be remarkable in any ancient civilization. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro stood a structure that modern archaeologists call the Great Bath, though its actual purpose remains one of the civilization's many enigmas. This rectangular pool, lined with bitumen to prevent leakage and surrounded by galleries and rooms, was constructed with a precision that speaks to both engineering skill and profound significance in the lives of those who built it. The pool measures approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. Steps descend from both ends into perfectly level water, while carefully engineered drains allowed the pool to be emptied and refilled. The quality of construction, using carefully fitted bricks and waterproof mortar, indicates that this was no ordinary structure, but something central to community life. Some scholars suggest the Great Bath served ritual purposes, perhaps for religious purification ceremonies, similar to those that would later become central to Indian religious practice. Others propose it might have been a public facility for bathing and social gathering.
The surrounding rooms, including what appears to be a well-appointed private chamber, hint at ceremonial functions that we can only imagine. The mathematical knowledge required for such construction reveals sophisticated understanding of geometry and hydraulic engineering. The builders calculated precisely how much water the pool would hold, how quickly it could be filled or drained, and how to prevent structural damage from the weight and pressure of contained water. These calculations required mathematical concepts and engineering principles that demonstrate remarkable intellectual achievement.
Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of Harappan civilization lies in what archaeologists have not found. Unlike contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt, where massive palaces and temples proclaim the power of kings and gods, Indus cities seem to have been organized according to different principles entirely. The absence of clearly identifiable royal residences or religious monuments suggests a form of social organization unlike any other known ancient civilization. The uniformity of Harappan culture, identical weights and measures, standardized brick sizes, consistent urban planning, clearly indicates centralized authority of some kind. Someone was making decisions about city layout, construction standards, and commercial practices. Someone was coordinating the production of standardized materials across hundreds of miles. Yet this authority left few obvious signatures in monumental architecture. Some scholars propose that Harappan society might have been organized as a confederation of merchant cities, governed by councils of elders or trade associations rather than individual rulers. Others suggest that religious authority, perhaps exercised by priest kings whose palaces have not been identified, provided the organizing principle for this remarkably consistent civilization. The standardized weights and measures found throughout Harappan sites reveal a society deeply concerned with fair trade and accurate measurement. These weights, carved from carefully selected stones and polished to precise specifications, followed a decimal system that facilitated complex calculations. The smallest weights could measure quantities as small as a few grams, while the largest could handle loads measured in kilograms. The prosperity of Harappan civilization rested partly on extensive trade networks that connected the Indus Valley with regions thousands of miles away. Harappan seals, carved from steatite and featuring distinctive animals and undeciphered symbols, have been discovered in Mesopotamian cities, indicating regular commercial contact between these distant civilizations. These square seals, typically measuring about 2 inches on each side, feature beautifully carved animals: humped bulls, water buffalo, rhinoceros, tigers, and mysterious unicorn-like creatures. Above each animal appear symbols from the still undeciphered Harappan script. The seals were pressed into clay to mark packages of goods, indicating ownership and perhaps specifying contents or quality. The trade goods themselves reveal the sophistication of Harappan craftsmanship and the extent of their commercial networks. Cotton, apparently first cultivated and woven in the Indus Valley, appeared in Mesopotamian texts as a luxury import prized for its softness and durability. Harappan merchants also exported carnelian beads, requiring months of patient drilling and polishing to create the intricate designs that made them valuable across the ancient world. From distant regions came materials that Harappan artisans transformed into objects of beauty and utility. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Central Asia, gold from southern India, and silver from Iran all found their way to Harappan workshops.
The skill with which these materials were worked demonstrates not only technical expertise, but aesthetic sensibility that created objects beautiful enough to compete in international markets.
Perhaps the greatest mystery of Harappan civilization lies in its writing system, preserved on thousands of seals, pottery fragments, and copper tablets, but still undeciphered after nearly a century of scholarly effort. The symbols, numbering around 400 distinct signs, appear on objects ranging from tiny steatite seals to large copper plates, suggesting a writing system used for multiple purposes. The inscriptions are typically brief, consisting of only 4 or 5 symbols, though some longer texts exist. This brevity has led some scholars to suggest that the symbols might represent names, titles, or inventory notations, rather than extended literary texts. Others argue that longer text once existed on perishable materials like palm leaves or cloth, which have not survived in the archaeological record. The direction of writing appears to change depending on the length of the inscription. Short texts seem to be written from right to left, while longer inscriptions sometimes continue from left to right on the next line, creating a pattern called boustrophodon, meaning "as the ox turns" in Greek. This variable direction suggests a flexible writing system adapted to different purposes and formats. Attempts to decipher the script have proposed connections to various language families, Dravidian, Indo-European, Austroasiatic, but none has gained universal scholarly acceptance. The absence of a bilingual text, comparable to the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs, leaves scholars to work with statistical analysis, symbol frequencies, and comparisons with later Indian scripts. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses of daily life in these ancient cities. Harappan houses, typically built around central courtyards, provided privacy for families while maintaining connections to neighborhood communities. The ground floors often contained workshops where craftsmen produced pottery, textiles, or metal objects, while upper floors served as private living spaces. The sophistication of Harappan craftsmanship appears in objects both practical and beautiful. Pottery vessels display elegant proportions and refined decorative motifs. Bronze figurines capture the grace of dancers and the dignity of priests or rulers. Jewelry demonstrates mastery of metalworking techniques, while carved seals reveal artistic sensibilities that valued both naturalistic representation and symbolic expression. Children's toys discovered in Harappan sites, miniature carts with movable wheels, whistles shaped like birds, board games with elaborate rules, suggest a society that valued play and leisure alongside work and commerce. The uniformity of these toys across different cities indicates shared cultural values and perhaps educational practices that prepared children for adult roles in Harappan society. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities of the Indus Valley began to show signs of decline. The causes remain debated among scholars, with proposed explanations ranging from climate change and river shifts to internal social breakdown and external invasion. Archaeological evidence suggests that the decline was gradual rather than catastrophic, with cities being rebuilt at lower levels of sophistication before eventually being abandoned. Some populations appear to have migrated eastward toward the Gangetic Plain, where new cultural patterns were emerging. Others may have moved southward into Gujarat and the Deccan Plateau, carrying with them technologies and cultural practices that would influence later Indian civilizations. The mystery of the Harappan decline adds poignancy to their achievements. A civilization that had maintained remarkable consistency across vast distances and many centuries ultimately succumbed to forces we can only speculate about. Yet their legacy lived on in the urban traditions, craft techniques,
and perhaps religious practices that would shape later Indian civilization.
As the monsoon clouds gathered over the Gangetic Plain around 1200 BCE, small communities of cattle herders and farmers were developing a revolutionary approach to understanding the cosmos. These people, referring to themselves as Arya, meaning noble or cultivated ones, composed hymns and engaged in philosophical speculation that would become the foundation of one of the world's oldest continuous religious traditions. Their earliest compositions, preserved in the Rig Veda, reveal a society in the midst of profound transformation. The 1,000 hymns of this ancient collection celebrate deities who controlled the forces that shaped human destiny: Indra, the storm god, who released the life-giving rains; Agni, the sacrificial fire that carried human offerings to heaven; Varuna, the cosmic sovereign who maintained moral order; and Surya, the sun whose daily journey maintained the rhythm of time itself. These hymns were not written down, but preserved through elaborate systems of oral transmission that maintained perfect accuracy across centuries. The techniques developed for this preservation, specific breathing patterns, precise pronunciation, rhythmic chanting, and mnemonic devices, created what scholars recognize as one of the most sophisticated oral traditions in human history. Families of priests specialized in memorizing particular portions of the collection, passing their responsibilities from father to son across generations that stretched into the distant future. The poetic sophistication of these ancient hymns still impresses modern readers. Complex metaphors compare the sun to a swift horse racing across the sky, rainfall to the generous gifts of a wealthy patron, and the sacrificial fire to a priest who knows the proper procedures for every ceremony. The psychological insight displayed in these compositions, understanding of human hopes and fears, recognition of moral complexity, awareness of life's fundamental uncertainties, reveals minds capable of both concrete observation and abstract reflection. The Vedic emphasis on precise pronunciation led to remarkably sophisticated analysis of language itself. Understanding that even slight changes in pronunciation could alter the meaning and effectiveness of sacred utterances, Vedic scholars developed detailed studies of phonetics that identified the exact tongue positions, breath control, and vocal modulations required for different sounds. This scientific approach to language would eventually produce grammatical works of extraordinary precision and comprehensiveness. The systematization of Sanskrit grammar, while reaching its culmination in later centuries, began with these early investigations into the nature of sacred speech. The recognition that language itself possessed creative power, that properly pronounced words could influence both human consciousness and cosmic processes, motivated technical studies that rivaled any ancient civilization's linguistic achievements. The sacrificial rituals that formed the center of early Vedic religious practice required not only precise pronunciation but also accurate timing and measurement. Priests developed astronomical observations of remarkable accuracy, tracking the positions of stars and the movements of celestial bodies to determine auspicious moments for ceremonies. The concept of cosmic cycles, vast periods of creation, maintenance, and destruction, emerged from these observations of celestial patterns that seemed to reveal the underlying structure of time itself. Mathematical knowledge grew from ritual requirements as well.
The construction of fire altars demanded precise geometric calculations, leading to discoveries about relationships between different geometric shapes and their areas. The Shulba Sutras, technical manuals for altar construction, contain mathematical insights that anticipate later developments in geometry and algebra.
Around 800 BCE, within the Vedic tradition itself, a philosophical revolution began that would transform human understanding of consciousness and reality. Thinkers in forest retreats started questioning the ultimate efficacy of ritual sacrifice, asking instead fundamental questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and liberation from suffering. These speculations, preserved in texts called Upanishads, meaning sitting near, developed through intimate conversations between teachers and students who had withdrawn from ordinary social life to pursue spiritual understanding. The forest settings of these discussions were not accidental. The natural environment, with its cycles of growth and decay, its interdependent ecosystems, and its seasonal rhythms, provided a living laboratory for investigating the nature of existence. The central insight that emerged from these investigations concerned the relationship between individual consciousness and ultimate reality. Through careful introspection and logical analysis, these philosophers concluded that the apparent distinction between the observer and the observed, between the self and the cosmos, was ultimately illusory. The individual self, Atman, and ultimate reality, Brahman, were discovered to be different aspects of the same underlying truth. This realization was expressed in the famous formula Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, indicating that the ultimate ground of the universe and the deepest essence of individual consciousness were identical. This understanding would become the foundation of later Indian philosophy, influencing not only Hindu thought, but also the development of Buddhism and Jainism. Vedic society developed complex systems of social organization that balanced individual needs with communal requirements. The emerging Varna system, dividing society into Brahmins, priests and teachers, Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, Vaishyas, merchants and farmers, and Shudras, laborers and servants, provided social stability while theoretically allowing mobility based on individual qualities and achievements. This social system was understood not as arbitrary human convention, but as reflecting cosmic principles of order and harmony. Each Varna had specific duties, dharma, that contributed to the welfare of the whole society, while individual life stages, ashramas, provided frameworks for balancing material responsibilities with spiritual development. The ashrama system divided life into 4 stages: brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyasi. This framework acknowledged that different life phases required different priorities and practices. Young people needed education and skill development. Adults needed to fulfill family and social responsibilities, while older individuals could focus on spiritual pursuits and the preparation for death. This balance between worldly engagement and spiritual transcendence would characterize Indian civilization throughout its history. Unlike traditions that saw material and spiritual life as fundamentally opposed, Vedic thought developed ways of understanding worldly activity as potentially spiritual practice when performed with proper understanding and motivation. Toward the end of this period, two great epic poems began taking form through oral tradition. The Ramayana and Mahabharata would eventually grow into massive works that combined adventure narratives with profound philosophical and ethical teachings. These epics served as vehicles for transmitting cultural values and spiritual insights to audiences far beyond the scholarly elite who preserved the Vedas. The stories told in these epics addressed moral dilemmas that ordinary people faced in their daily lives. How should one balance competing loyalties to family, society, and higher principles? What actions are justified in extreme circumstances? How can individuals maintain their integrity while fulfilling social roles that sometimes require morally ambiguous choices? The characters in these epics, Rama and Sita, Arjuna and Krishna, Draupadi and Bhishma, became models for how to navigate life's complexities with wisdom and dignity. Their struggles and achievements provided templates for understanding human potential and limitation, while their failures offered cautionary examples of how even noble individuals could make tragic mistakes. The Bhagavad Gita, which would eventually be embedded within the Mahabharata, addressed the fundamental question of how to live ethically in a morally complex world. Its teaching that one should perform necessary actions without attachment to their results would influence not only Indian thought, but philosophers worldwide, offering a practical approach to combining worldly effectiveness with spiritual development. The sophisticated oral traditions that preserved Vedic literature also fostered the development of various forms of creative expression. Hymns composed for ritual purposes often displayed remarkable poetic beauty, combining religious devotion with artistic achievement that would influence Indian literature for millennia. The development of Sanskrit as a refined literary language provided a medium for expressing complex philosophical concepts with precision and elegance. The grammatical systematization that would reach its culmination in later centuries began during this period, with detailed analysis of how language could be used most effectively for different purposes. Technical literature also flourished during this period, as specialists in various fields, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, began creating systematic texts that preserved and transmitted professional knowledge. These works combined practical instruction with theoretical understanding, creating intellectual traditions that would support later scientific and technological developments. In the prosperous kingdoms that had emerged along the Gangetic Plain during the 6th century BCE, a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama confronted a question that would reverberate through human history. Why do all conscious beings experience suffering? And is complete liberation from this suffering actually possible? His systematic investigation of this question, conducted through years of ascetic practice and meditative inquiry, would establish Buddhism as one of the world's most influential philosophical and religious traditions. The society into which Siddhartha was born had achieved considerable prosperity through the cultivation of rice and the expansion of trade networks that connected the Gangetic Plain with distant regions. The early cities of this period, Rajagriha, Shravasti, Vaishali, Kapilavastu, housed merchants, craftsmen, and rulers who patronized both traditional Vedic priests and wandering philosophical teachers called Shramanas. This intellectual ferment created conditions where fundamental questions about existence could be explored with unprecedented freedom and depth.
The 16 great kingdoms, Mahajanapadas, of this period competed not only for territory and trade routes, but also for philosophical and religious prestige. Royal courts welcomed teachers who could provide new insights into the nature of reality, human destiny, and effective governance. This competitive environment encouraged intellectual innovation and prevented any single orthodoxy from dominating spiritual and philosophical discourse. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals cities with sophisticated infrastructure, standardized weights and measures, and extensive craft production. The prosperity that supported this urban development also created leisure time for philosophical speculation and religious experimentation. People who were not absorbed in mere survival could afford to ask fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of existence.
Prince Siddhartha's decision to abandon his comfortable palace life and seek understanding through spiritual practice reflected a crisis that would resonate with thoughtful individuals throughout history. Despite having access to every form of pleasure and security that his society could provide, he remained troubled by the universality of aging, sickness, death, and psychological suffering. The traditional religious answers available in his time, ritual sacrifice, caste obligations, ascetic practices, seemed inadequate to address the depth of his concerns. Rather than accepting received wisdom, he embarked on his own systematic investigation, first studying with renowned meditation teachers and then practicing severe asceticism that nearly cost him his life. After 6 years of following approaches that proved ultimately unsuccessful, Siddhartha abandoned extreme asceticism and developed what he called the middle way, a balanced approach that avoided both sensual indulgence and self-torture. This methodological innovation would prove as important as any specific doctrine he later taught. Under the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, through systematic meditation practice, he achieved the insight that would transform him into the Buddha, the awakened one. His analysis identified craving, tanha, as the root cause of suffering and outlined an eightfold path of ethical conduct, mental cultivation, and wisdom development that could lead to complete liberation from all forms of psychological pain. The Buddha's approach to understanding reality displayed remarkable similarities to what we would now recognize as scientific methodology. He began with careful observation of phenomena, documenting the universality of suffering in all forms of conscious experience. He then formulated a hypothesis about causation, that suffering arises from craving and ignorance about the true nature of existence. He tested this hypothesis through experimental practice, meditation techniques, and ethical disciplines. Finally, he developed systematic methods that others could follow to verify his discoveries through their own direct experience. This empirical approach extended to his teaching method as well. Rather than requiring faith in dogmatic statements or submission to religious authority, the Buddha encouraged followers to test his teachings through their own practice and experience. "Come and see," he invited, offering practices whose effectiveness could be personally verified rather than beliefs that required acceptance on trust. The Four Noble Truths provided a diagnostic framework for understanding the human condition, the reality of suffering, its psychological causes, the possibility of its complete cessation, and the systematic path that leads to liberation. This analysis treated suffering not as punishment for moral failings or cosmic accident, but as a natural consequence of psychological processes that could be understood and transformed through appropriate training.
The Noble Eightfold Path outlined specific practices for achieving this transformation: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This comprehensive program addressed every aspect of human life: intellectual understanding, emotional development, ethical conduct, economic activity, and mental cultivation, recognizing that genuine spiritual progress required integrated development rather than focus on any single area.
Contemporary with the Buddha, though the exact chronological relationship remains debated among scholars, Mahavira developed another revolutionary approach to the problem of suffering and liberation. Building on earlier Jain teachings that may have been even more ancient than Vedic traditions, he advocated absolute nonviolence, ahimsa, as both ethical principle and practical method for achieving spiritual freedom. Jainism's analysis identified violence, even in thought, as the primary obstacle to spiritual progress. This understanding led to elaborate practices designed to minimize harm to all living beings, including microscopic organisms whose existence Jain practitioners somehow intuited centuries before scientific verification. The extreme sensitivity to the interconnectedness of life that characterized Jain practice led to innovations in medicine and other fields, since Jain practitioners required healing methods that caused minimal harm to other organisms. Mahavira's followers developed sophisticated philosophical systems that analyzed the nature of knowledge, reality, and spiritual development. The Jain doctrine of Anikantavada, multiple perspectives, recognized the truth is complex enough to require different viewpoints for complete understanding. This epistemological sophistication would influence later Indian philosophical development across sectarian boundaries. The emphasis on individual spiritual responsibility in Jainism created space for remarkable achievements by both men and women practitioners. Jain nuns often outnumbered monks and achieved recognition as accomplished teachers and practitioners. The tradition's emphasis on individual effort rather than divine grace or ritual effectiveness made spiritual achievement theoretically accessible to anyone willing to undertake the necessary practices. Both Buddhism and Jainism challenged prevailing social assumptions about women's spiritual capacity. The Buddha, after initial reluctance that may have reflected social pressures rather than personal conviction, established an order of nuns and declared that women could achieve the highest levels of spiritual realization. Mahavira's mother, Trishala, was considered spiritually advanced, and Jainism traditionally honored several female spiritual teachers. These traditions' emphasis on individual spiritual development rather than ritual authority inherited through caste or gender created unprecedented opportunities for women to achieve recognition as teachers and practitioners. The nun Mahapajapati, the Buddha's stepmother and the first woman to be ordained in the Buddhist order, became a renowned teacher whose insights were preserved in the early Buddhist literature. The challenges faced by these early female practitioners revealed both the revolutionary potential and the practical limitations of spiritual movements within patriarchal societies. While both traditions affirmed women's spiritual capacity and principle, the actual conditions under which women practiced often reflected social constraints that made their achievements even more remarkable. Both Buddhism and Jainism developed sophisticated technologies of consciousness that we would now recognize as early forms of psychological science. Buddhist meditation manuals described detailed maps of mental states cataloging the progression of concentration levels and the systematic elimination of mental obstacles to clarity and peace. The Abhidhamma literature, which developed somewhat later but drew on early meditation experiences, analyzed consciousness into component processes with remarkable precision. This phenomenological psychology identified how perception, feeling, mental formations, and consciousness itself arose and passed away in rapid succession, creating the illusion of a permanent self while actually consisting of constantly changing processes. Meditation practices were designed not only to achieve temporary states of peace and clarity, but to develop insight into the fundamental nature of mind and reality. Advanced practitioners learned to observe the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and sensations with such precision that they could identify the psychological mechanisms that created suffering and develop the skills necessary to transform these processes. The psychological insights developed through these practices anticipated modern cognitive science in recognizing that much of what we consider solid reality is actually constructed through mental processes. The understanding that changing these mental processes could transform experience provided practical methods for achieving psychological freedom that remain effective today. By teaching in local languages rather than Sanskrit, and by denying the ultimate authority of Vedic scriptures and Brahmin priesthood, both Buddhism and Jainism challenged the religious monopoly that had been developing in Vedic society. Their emphasis on individual spiritual development, achievable through ethical conduct and mental training rather than expensive ritual ceremonies, appealed particularly to merchants and urban dwellers who had wealth but lacked high caste status. This democratization of spiritual authority had profound social implications. If liberation depended on individual effort and understanding rather than birth into privileged castes or performance of costly rituals, then spiritual achievement became theoretically accessible to all people regardless of social position. The Buddha explicitly rejected caste distinctions within his monastic community, while Mahavira taught that spiritual progress depended entirely on individual conduct rather than social status. The institutional forms developed by these movements proved remarkably durable. The Sangha, the community of Buddhist monks and nuns, created structures for preserving and transmitting teachings across generations while maintaining standards of practice and conduct. Monastic rules, Vinaya, balanced individual spiritual development with community harmony, while networks of lay supporters provided material support in exchange for spiritual instruction.
The young warrior Chandragupta Maurya achieved what no Indian ruler before him had accomplished: the unification of most of the subcontinent under a single political authority. His displacement of the Nanda dynasty around 321 BCE and subsequent territorial expansion created the Mauryan Empire, which would eventually stretch from the Hindu Kush Mountains to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the northern Deccan Plateau. The strategic genius behind this achievement belonged partly to Chandragupta's advisor, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, whose political treatise, the Arthashastra, outlined principles of statecraft that combined practical governance with philosophical reflection on the nature of power and authority. This remarkable work analyzed economic policy, military strategy, diplomatic relations, and administrative structure with systematic rigor that would influence rulers for centuries. The timing of Mauryan expansion proved as important as its military and administrative innovations. Alexander the Great's withdrawal from northwestern India in 325 BCE had created a power vacuum in regions that had previously been controlled by local kingdoms. The instability following Alexander's departure provided opportunities for expansion that Chandragupta exploited with remarkable skill and determination. The encounter between Chandragupta and Seleucus Nicator, Alexander's successor in the Eastern Territories, resulted in a diplomatic agreement that established the Mauryan Empire as an equal to the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander's conquests. This recognition of Mauryan sovereignty by a major Hellenistic power demonstrated the empire's military strength and diplomatic sophistication. Chandragupta's political theory, as preserved in the Arthashastra, represented one of the most sophisticated analyses of governmental power and administrative organization in the ancient world. The text balanced royal authority with institutional constraints, creating what modern scholars recognize as an early form of constitutional monarchy, where the ruler, while supreme, governed through established procedures and remained accountable to dharmic principles that limited arbitrary power. The economic analysis within the Arthashastra displayed remarkable understanding of market forces, resource allocation, and fiscal policy. The text described supply and demand relationships, advocated infrastructure development as a foundation of state power, and outlined taxation policies designed to promote both royal revenue and general prosperity. The recognition that political authority ultimately depended on economic productivity led to systematic attention to agriculture, trade, and craft production as foundations of imperial power. The administrative framework described in the Arthashastra established provincial governance systems that balanced central coordination with local autonomy. Provincial governors, Rajukas, oversaw regional affairs while remaining accountable to royal inspection and oversight. A complex bureaucracy managed resource collection and distribution, while messenger systems maintained communication across the vast imperial territory. Military organization received equally systematic attention. The text described intelligence networks, strategic planning, siege warfare, and the coordination of different military units, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants in comprehensive campaigns. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and strategic deception revealed understanding that successful warfare depended as much on information and psychology as on direct military confrontation.
Chandragupta's son, Bindusara, extended the empire southward into the Deccan Plateau, though the exact extent and methods of this expansion remain unclear from surviving sources. Greek accounts describe him as a sophisticated ruler who maintained diplomatic relations with Hellenistic kingdoms while expanding Mauryan administrative systems throughout the enlarged territory. The logistics of governing such vast territories required administrative innovations that would influence Indian statecraft for centuries. Road networks connected distant provinces with the imperial capital, while rest houses and communication facilities supported both official travel and commercial activity. The standardization of weights, measures, and legal procedures facilitated administration across regions with different languages and customs. Archaeological evidence from Mauryan sites reveals sophisticated urban planning and monumental architecture that proclaimed imperial power, while serving practical administrative functions. The Mauryan capital at Pataliputra, described by contemporary visitors as one of the world's great cities, featured massive wooden fortifications, planned residential districts, and administrative complexes that housed the imperial bureaucracy. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent and underwent its most profound ideological transformation under Bindusara's son, Ashoka, who ruled from approximately 268 to 232 BCE. Initially following traditional patterns of expansion through military conquest, Ashoka's perspective underwent dramatic change following his brutal victory over the independent kingdom of Kalinga on the eastern coast. The carnage of the Kalinga War, which Ashoka's own rock edicts describe as causing over 100,000 deaths and 150,000 deportations, apparently shocked the emperor into fundamental reconsideration of royal duty and the nature of legitimate governance. His famous 13th Rock Edict expresses what appears to be genuine remorse. The beloved of the gods was deeply pained, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous and wearisome to the beloved of the gods. Following his conversion to Buddhist principles, Ashoka implemented policies that represented a remarkable experiment in ethical governance. Rather than ruling through fear and coercion alone, he attempted to govern according to dharmic principles that emphasized non-violence, truthfulness, and active concern for subjects' welfare. Ashoka's inscriptions, carved on rocks and pillars throughout the empire, constitute the most extensive record of ancient Indian political thought available to modern scholars. These edicts reveal an emperor struggling to balance practical governance requirements with spiritual principles, acknowledging the inherent difficulty of implementing non-violent ideals within political systems that ultimately depend on coercive power. The establishment of Dharma Mahamatras, officials specifically responsible for ensuring that governmental policies aligned with ethical principles, represented an institutional innovation designed to create accountability mechanisms that would prevent abuse of power at local levels. These officials investigated grievances, supervised provincial governance, and reported directly to the emperor about conditions throughout the empire. Ashoka's edicts describe extensive welfare programs, including the construction of hospitals for both humans and animals, the planting of medicinal gardens, the digging of wells along major roads, and the establishment of rest houses for travelers. These projects reflected understanding that royal legitimacy required active promotion of subjects' welfare rather than mere maintenance of order and extraction of revenue.
Ashoka's approach to religious diversity within the empire demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing rulers of multicultural territories. While clearly favoring Buddhist institutions and principles, his edicts consistently advocate respect for all religious traditions and warn against religious conflicts that could destabilize imperial unity. The famous 12th Rock Edict articulates a policy of religious tolerance that was remarkable for its time. All religions should reside everywhere, for all of them desire self-control and purity of heart. But people have various desires and various passions, and they may practice all of what they should or only a part of it. Buddhist missionary expeditions sent to various regions during Ashoka's reign apparently aimed to spread Buddhist teachings through persuasion rather than coercion. The success of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, where Ashokan missions established institutions that survive to the present day, demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach to cultural influence through voluntary conversion rather than political imposition. The Mauryan administrative system represented remarkable achievement in pre-modern governance. creating institutional frameworks capable of coordinating activities across unprecedented distances and diverse populations. The systematic organization of provinces, districts, and local administrative units provided hierarchical structures that balanced central control with regional adaptation. Revenue systems based on land surveys and standardized taxation created predictable income streams that supported both military forces and welfare programs. The maintenance of detailed records, unfortunately most have not survived, enabled planning and resource allocation that maximized imperial capabilities while minimizing local disruption. The network of roads, rest houses, and communication systems that supported Mauryan administration also facilitated commercial development and cultural exchange. Merchants could travel safely across vast distances, while ideas, technologies, and artistic styles spread throughout the empire and beyond to regions connected through diplomatic and commercial relationships. Despite its administrative sophistication and ideological innovations, the Mauryan Empire faced structural challenges that would ultimately contribute to its decline. The vast distances involved in imperial communication made central control difficult to maintain consistently. Regional cultures and political traditions created centrifugal forces that required constant attention to prevent fragmentation. The costs of maintaining large military forces and extensive administrative bureaucracies strained even the empire's considerable resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that some regions experienced economic difficulties during the later Mauryan period, possibly due to the burden of imperial taxation combined with other economic pressures. Succession disputes following Ashoka's death around 232 BCE revealed weaknesses in imperial institutions that had depended heavily on individual rulers' capabilities rather than systematic procedures for leadership transition. The fragmentation of central authority that followed created opportunities for regional powers to assert independence and foreign groups to establish footholds in formerly Mauryan territories.
The Mauryan Empire's collapse around 185 BCE did not erase its institutional and cultural achievements. The administrative techniques, legal principles, and approaches to governing diverse populations developed during the Mauryan period provided precedents that would influence Indian political development for centuries. The concept of dharmic governance, the integration of ethical principles with practical administration, and the recognition that royal legitimacy required active promotion of subjects' welfare all became recurring themes in Indian political thought. Later empires would draw on Mauryan precedents while adapting them to different circumstances and challenges. Ashoka's edicts, preserved in stone throughout the former empire, continued to influence political and religious thinking long after Mauryan power had ended. The ideal of the righteous ruler, who governs according to universal ethical principles rather than mere self-interest, provided a model for kingship that transcended particular dynastic or cultural traditions. Following the Mauryan collapse around 185 BCE, political power in the Indian subcontinent fragmented among numerous competing dynasties and foreign groups. Rather than representing cultural decline, this fragmentation paradoxically facilitated one of the most creative periods in Indian civilization, as regional courts, foreign rulers, and emerging urban centers competed for prestige through patronage of learning, arts, and religious institutions. The Sungas, who directly succeeded Mauryan rule in the Gangetic heartland, maintained Hindu traditions while adapting Mauryan administrative techniques to smaller territorial units. In the northwest, Indo-Greek kingdoms established by Alexander's successors created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange between Indian and Hellenistic traditions. The Kushans, Central Asian nomads who established empire across northern India and Central Asia, facilitated trade and cultural contact across vast distances. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals flourishing urban centers, extensive trade networks, and remarkable artistic achievement. The diversity of architectural styles, sculptural traditions, and craft production suggests creative environments fostered by political competition and cultural exchange rather than unified imperial control. The great universities that emerged during this period, Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Takshashila, attracted students from across Asia, establishing India as the recognized center of Buddhist learning while simultaneously preserving and developing Hindu philosophical traditions. These institutions combined religious instruction with secular learning, creating intellectual environments where different philosophical systems could interact and influence each other.
The Kushan Empire, established by Central Asian nomads but centered in northwestern India, created perhaps the most cosmopolitan civilization of the ancient world. Under rulers like Kanishka, whose exact dates remain debated, but whose reign probably fell in the 2nd century CE, this empire facilitated unprecedented cultural synthesis among Indian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Chinese traditions. Kushan coins provide remarkable evidence for this cultural integration, featuring images that combine Greek gods with Persian deities, Hindu divinities with Buddhist symbols, and Roman artistic techniques with Indian religious iconography. This numismatic evidence suggests not merely political tolerance, but active promotion of cultural synthesis at the highest levels of imperial administration. The Gandhara school of art, which flourished under Kushan patronage, represents one of the most successful fusions of different artistic traditions in world history. Greek sculptural techniques, learned from Hellenistic artists and craftsmen, were applied to Buddhist subjects with results that influenced artistic development across Asia. The graceful figures of Gandhara Buddhas and Bodhisattvas combine Greek naturalism with Indian spiritual expression in ways that created entirely new aesthetic possibilities. Trade networks under Kushan administration connected the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia, China, and the Roman Empire through both overland and maritime routes. Archaeological evidence from Kushan sites includes Roman glassware, Chinese silk, Central Asian goldwork, and Indian cotton textiles, demonstrating commercial relations that spanned the known world. The religious policies of Kushan rulers reflected practical wisdom about governing diverse populations, as well as genuine intellectual curiosity about different spiritual traditions. Royal patronage supported Buddhist monasteries, Hindu temples, Zoroastrian fire altars, and Greek cult sites simultaneously, creating an environment where different religious traditions could develop while learning from each other. During the classical period,
Indian mathematicians made discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of quantity, calculation, and the nature of mathematical relationships. The development of the place-value decimal system, including the crucial concept of zero as both placeholder and number, transformed mathematical possibilities not only in India, but eventually throughout the world. The mathematical innovations of this period grew partly from practical needs: architectural calculations for temple construction, astronomical observations for calendar systems, commercial computations for trade, but also from purely theoretical investigations into the nature of numerical relationships. The Sulba Sutras, technical manuals for altar construction, contain geometric insights that anticipate later developments in mathematics by centuries.
Aryabhata, whose major work was completed in 499 CE, calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, explained lunar eclipses correctly, and developed trigonometric functions that would not be improved upon for centuries. His understanding that the Earth rotates on its axis challenged conventional astronomical wisdom while providing more elegant explanations for observed celestial phenomena. The medical traditions codified in texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, and therapeutic interventions. The emphasis on prevention through lifestyle modification, the integration of physical and mental health considerations, and the development of surgical techniques created medical systems whose effectiveness is still being studied and appreciated today. These medical texts describe surgical procedures including cataract removal, kidney stone extraction, and plastic surgery techniques for repairing damaged noses and ears. The systematic classification of diseases, the detailed pharmacological knowledge, and the sophisticated understanding of pulse diagnosis reveal medical traditions that combined careful empirical observation with theoretical frameworks for understanding health and illness. The Gupta Empire, established by Chandragupta I around 320 CE and reaching its zenith under Chandragupta II, 375 to 415 CE, created conditions that many historians consider the classical flowering of Indian civilization. Unlike previous empires built primarily through military conquest, Gupta authority rested largely on cultural prestige, administrative competence, and economic prosperity rather than overwhelming coercive power. The Gupta approach to imperial administration balanced central coordination with local autonomy in ways that encouraged regional cultural development while maintaining overall political unity. Provincial governors, often members of the royal family, exercised considerable discretion in adapting imperial policies to local conditions, while regular communication with the imperial court ensured coordination of major policies and resource allocation. The prosperity of the Gupta period supported remarkable achievements in literature, art, architecture, and learning. The court attracted the most distinguished scholars and artists of the age, creating competitive environments where intellectual and creative achievement could flourish under royal patronage while maintaining connections with broader cultural traditions. Kalidasa, often considered the greatest poet in Sanskrit literature, created works during this period that combined technical mastery with profound emotional insight and philosophical depth. His dramas and lyric poems influenced not only subsequent Indian literature, but also through later translations, inspired poets and writers throughout the world. The psychological sophistication, natural imagery, and spiritual themes of his work represent classical Indian literary achievement at its highest level.
The classical period witnessed the crystallization of Indian philosophical schools, darshanas, into systematic approaches to fundamental questions about knowledge, reality, and liberation. The six orthodox schools, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedanta, each developed comprehensive methodologies for investigating reality while maintaining connections to Vedic traditions. The Sankhya system analyzed reality into fundamental principles of consciousness, Purusha, and matter, Prakriti, providing a dualistic framework that explained both psychological and physical phenomena. The Yoga school, associated with Patanjali's systematic presentation, developed practical techniques for achieving direct realization of this philosophical analysis through disciplined mental and physical training. The Nyaya school created sophisticated methods of logical analysis that influenced not only Hindu philosophical development, but also Buddhist and Jain logical traditions. The systematic investigation of inference, the analysis of causal relationships, and the development of criteria for valid knowledge created philosophical methodologies that could engage with any intellectual tradition while maintaining rigorous standards for logical consistency. Nagarjuna's development of Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophy during this period provided the most sophisticated logical analysis of the interdependence of all phenomena. His middle way between eternalism and nihilism used rigorous logical investigation to demonstrate that all phenomena arise through dependent origination rather than possessing independent existence, providing Buddhist thought with philosophical foundations that could engage with the most sophisticated Indian logical traditions. Gupta period artists achieved a classical balance between realistic representation and idealized spiritual expression that influenced Indian aesthetics for centuries. The cave temples at Ajanta, with their sophisticated paintings depicting Buddhist themes, demonstrate technical mastery combined with spiritual depth that rivals any artistic achievement in world history. These paintings show remarkable understanding of perspective, color theory, psychological expression, and narrative composition. The artists who created them possessed not only technical skills, but also deep understanding of the religious and philosophical themes they depicted. The integration of artistic beauty with spiritual instruction created environments designed to facilitate religious experience through aesthetic appreciation. Temple architecture during this period developed the essential forms that would characterize Hindu sacred building throughout subsequent history. The mathematical precision of temple proportions, the integration of sculptural programs with architectural space, and the creation of environments designed to facilitate spiritual experience through beauty established principles that continued to guide temple construction for over 1,000 years. The sculptural traditions that emerged during this period combined naturalistic observation with symbolic expression in ways that created new possibilities for religious art. The famous Gupta Buddha images achieve a serenity and spiritual presence that influenced Buddhist artistic traditions throughout Asia, while Hindu temple sculptures developed iconographic systems that could express complex theological concepts through visual forms.
The classical period witnessed the development of commercial networks that connected Indian markets with trading centers throughout the known world. Indian cotton textiles, spices, precious stones, and crafted goods reached markets from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean, while foreign goods, Chinese silk, Central Asian horses, Roman gold flowed into Indian cities. The sophistication of commercial practices during this period included developed banking systems, standardized weights and measures, commercial law codes, and insurance arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade despite its inherent risks. Merchant guilds, shrenis,
provided institutional frameworks that balanced competitive commerce with cooperative risk-sharing and quality control. Urban centers like Ujjain, Pataliputra, and Kanchipuram became cosmopolitan environments where merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and officials from diverse cultural backgrounds interacted regularly. These cities developed distinctive architectural styles, literary traditions, and social customs that reflected their roles as nodes in international networks of exchange and communication. The agricultural prosperity that supported this commercial development resulted from improvements in irrigation technology, crop varieties, and farming techniques that increased productivity throughout the Gangetic Plain and Deccan Plateau. The integration of agricultural surplus production with craft manufacturing and long-distance trade created economic complexity that supported both imperial administration and cultural achievement. The classical period saw the development of devotional traditions that made advanced spiritual life accessible to ordinary people regardless of social position or educational achievement. The Bhagavata Purana and other devotional texts portrayed divine reality as responsive to sincere love rather than mere ritual correctness or intellectual understanding. These devotional movements democratized spiritual authority by emphasizing direct personal relationship with divine beings rather than mediation through priestly hierarchies. Stories of humble devotees achieving spiritual realization through pure devotion challenged assumptions about religious authority while providing models for spiritual practice that ordinary people could follow in their daily lives. The integration of devotional practices with philosophical understanding created synthetic approaches to spiritual development that combined emotional engagement with intellectual rigor. The Bhagavad Gita, which reached its final form during this period, provided systematic instruction for combining worldly effectiveness with spiritual development through the practice of desireless action. Temple worship during this period developed elaborate ritual systems that engaged all the senses in spiritual practice. The use of music, dance, visual arts, fragrant offerings, and ritual foods created immersive environments where devotees could experience direct contact with divine presence through carefully orchestrated aesthetic and ceremonial programs.
Indian cultural influence during the classical period extended far beyond political boundaries through commercial networks, religious missions, and voluntary cultural adoption. The spread of Indian architectural styles, religious practices, mathematical concepts, and political theories throughout Southeast Asia created cultural connections that survive to the present day. The establishment of Indian-influenced kingdoms in Cambodia, Java, Sumatra, and other Southeast Asian regions resulted from complex processes that combined commercial relationships, religious missions, and political alliances. These developments created networks of cultural connection that facilitated ongoing exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions. Chinese Buddhist pilgrims like Faxian and Huangzong visited Indian monasteries and universities during this period, leaving detailed accounts of educational institutions, religious practices, and social conditions that provide invaluable information about classical Indian civilization. Their reports also demonstrate the international reputation that Indian centers of learning had achieved throughout Asia. Following the decline of Gupta central authority around 550 CE, political power across the Indian subcontinent reorganized itself into numerous regional kingdoms, each developing distinctive cultural characteristics while maintaining connections to broader Indian civilizational traditions. The Chalukyas in the western Deccan, the Pallavas in Tamil Nadu, the Rashtrakutas in the central plateau, the Palas in Bengal, and the Pratiharas in northern India created competing centers of power that nonetheless shared common philosophical foundations and artistic sensibilities.
This political fragmentation, rather than representing cultural decline, facilitated remarkable regional creativity and innovation. Local rulers competed for prestige through architectural projects, literary patronage, and philosophical innovation, resulting in an explosion of temple building, regional literary traditions, and philosophical schools that enriched the overall development of Indian civilization. The absence of overwhelming imperial control allowed regional cultures to develop their own distinctive characteristics while remaining connected to pan-Indian networks of trade, learning, and religious practice. This balance between local identity and broader cultural participation created conditions where diversity and unity could coexist productively. Archaeological evidence from this period revealed sophisticated urban planning, extensive irrigation systems, and monumental architecture that demonstrate both technical capabilities and aesthetic ambitions. The competition between regional powers stimulated innovations in military technology, administrative techniques, and cultural patronage that advanced civilization across multiple domains simultaneously.
The Pallava dynasty, ruling from their capital at Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu, created one of the most influential cultural centers in medieval India. Under rulers like Narasimhavarman I, who reigned during the 7th century, the Pallavas pioneered architectural innovations that would influence temple design throughout South India and Southeast Asia. The rock-cut temples at Mamallapuram, modern Mahabalipuram, represent extraordinary achievements in both engineering and artistic vision. Sculptors carved entire temple complexes from single granite boulders, creating architectural spaces that combine structural functionality with elaborate decorative programs. These monuments required not only technical skill, but also sophisticated planning that could envision complex three-dimensional forms within the constraints imposed by natural rock formations. The Shore Temple at Mamallapuram, with its distinctive pyramidal towers, vimanas, and intricate sculptural programs, established architectural principles that would characterize Dravidian temple design for centuries. The integration of sculpture and architecture created environments where devotees could experience divine presence through carefully orchestrated sequences of visual and spatial experiences. Pallava patronage also supported the development of Tamil literature and Sanskrit scholarship, creating bilingual cultural environments where regional traditions could interact productively with pan-Indian intellectual movements. The establishment of educational institutions that taught both Tamil poetry and Sanskrit philosophy provided models for cultural synthesis that influenced later South Indian kingdoms. The Pallavas maintained extensive trade and cultural connections with Southeast Asia, as evidenced by architectural similarities between Pallava temples and contemporary structures in Cambodia and Java. These connections facilitated cultural exchange that spread Indian architectural styles, religious practices, and political concepts throughout maritime Asia. The Chola dynasty, emerging in the 9th century and reaching its zenith under Rajaraja I, 985 to 1014 CE, and his son Rajendra I, created the most extensive maritime empire in medieval Indian history. Chola naval forces controlled major trade routes throughout the Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea, establishing diplomatic and commercial relations with kingdoms in Southeast Asia, China, and the Persian Gulf region. The Brihadeshwara temple at Tanjavur, built by Rajaraja I, represents the pinnacle of Chola architectural achievement and one of the great monuments of world architecture. This massive structure, with its 216-foot tower, crowned by a monolithic capstone weighing approximately 80 tons, required engineering knowledge and organizational capacity that rivaled any contemporary achievement worldwide.
The temple's construction demanded sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, material properties, and construction logistics. The transportation and placement of the massive capstone, apparently accomplished using an earthen ramp that extended for miles, demonstrates problem-solving capabilities that created solutions to unprecedented technical challenges. The temple's sculptural programs adorning this temple depicted not only religious themes, but also court life, military victories, and cultural activities, providing comprehensive visual documentation of Chola society at its peak. These sculptural narratives serve as historical sources that complement and expand the information available in textual records.
Chola governance achieved remarkable balance between central authority and local autonomy through administrative innovations that would influence South Indian political organization for centuries. The empire was systematically organized into provinces, mandalams, districts, valanadus, and villages, urs, each with clearly defined responsibilities and revenue obligations. Local assemblies, sabhas, maintained considerable autonomy in managing village affairs while contributing to imperial resources through systematic taxation and labor service. The famous inscriptions describing village assemblies in places like Uttaramerur reveal sophisticated procedures that included term limits for officials, property qualifications for participation, and established methods for removing corrupt administrators. These local institutions created political stability that outlasted individual dynasties while facilitating efficient resource mobilization for imperial projects. The balance between democratic participation and administrative efficiency provided models for governance that combined popular involvement with effective administration. Chola naval innovations included the development of efficient warship designs, sophisticated navigation techniques, and coordinated fleet operations that could project power across vast ocean distances. The successful naval expedition against the Srivija kingdom in Sumatra around 1025 CE demonstrated capabilities that established Chola dominance over major maritime trade routes. The integration of naval power with commercial interests created economic networks that generated the wealth necessary to support monumental architecture, extensive bureaucracies, and cultural patronage. This economic foundation enabled cultural achievements that outlasted the political structures that created them. In northern India, the Gurjara Pratihara dynasty created another major center of cultural and political power, with their capital at Kannauj becoming renowned throughout Asia for its wealth, learning, and artistic achievement. Chinese traveler Xuanzang's descriptions of the city during the 7th century portrayed it as one of the world's great urban centers, comparable to Chang'an, Constantinople, and Baghdad. The Pratiharas successfully resisted Arab expansion into India for several centuries, maintaining the political independence of northern Indian kingdoms while facilitating cultural exchange through diplomatic and commercial channels. Their military innovations, particularly in cavalry tactics and fortress design, created defensive capabilities that influenced military development throughout medieval India. The Pratihara court attracted scholars, artists, and merchants from throughout the known world, creating cosmopolitan environments where different cultural traditions could interact and influence each other. This international character facilitated the development of artistic styles, literary forms, and philosophical approaches that synthesized diverse influences while maintaining distinctively Indian characteristics. Archaeological evidence from Pratihara sites reveals sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgy, and artistic production that supported both local consumption and export to distant markets. The economic prosperity that sustained these achievements resulted from successful integration of agriculture, craft production, and long-distance commerce. The Pala dynasty in Bengal and Bihar created the last major center of Buddhist learning and culture in India, maintaining traditions that were declining elsewhere while creating new developments in Buddhist philosophy, art, and institutional organization. Under rulers like Dharmapala and Devapala during the 8th and 9th centuries, the Palas rebuilt and expanded the great monastic universities of Nalanda and Vikramashila. These institutions attracted scholars from throughout the Buddhist world, creating international intellectual communities where Indian Buddhist traditions could interact with developments in Tibet, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. The libraries and educational facilities at these universities preserved and transmitted Buddhist learning while fostering new philosophical and scientific developments. Pala period art achieved distinctive syntheses of Indian and international Buddhist traditions, creating sculptural and painting styles that influenced Buddhist artistic development throughout Asia. The bronze sculptures produced in Pala workshops, with their graceful forms and spiritual intensity, represent some of the finest achievements in world Buddhist art. The Pala style spread throughout Asia through the monastic networks that connected Buddhist centers across the continent. Tibetan, Southeast Asian, and Central Asian Buddhist communities maintained connections with Pala institutions that facilitated ongoing cultural exchange and mutual influence. This period of regional kingdoms witnessed remarkable philosophical creativity and literary achievement. Shankara, the great Advaita Vedanta philosopher of the 8th century, systematized non-dualistic interpretations of Vedic texts, while developing logical arguments that could engage effectively with Buddhist and other philosophical traditions. Shankara's philosophical method combined rigorous scriptural analysis with direct experiential verification, creating systematic approaches to spiritual development that integrated intellectual understanding with practical realization. His establishment of monastic centers, mathas, throughout India created institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting Advaita teachings across regional and cultural boundaries. Regional literary traditions flourished during this period as vernacular languages developed sophisticated literary forms. Tamil poets like the Alvars and Nayanars created devotional literature that combined theological sophistication with intense emotional expression, influencing not only South Indian religious traditions, but also broader developments in devotional philosophy and practice. These vernacular literary traditions demonstrated that profound spiritual and philosophical insights could be expressed effectively in local languages, rather than requiring Sanskrit for authoritative religious discourse. This democratization of religious literature made advanced spiritual teachings accessible to broader populations while enriching regional cultural traditions. The regional kingdoms of this period competed in creating increasingly elaborate temple complexes that served simultaneously as religious centers, economic institutions, and artistic showcases. The Kailasanatha temple at Ellora, carved from solid rock by Rashtrakuta artisans, represents perhaps the most ambitious architectural project of the medieval period. This temple, conceived as a three-dimensional representation of Mount Kailash itself, required the removal of over 200,000 tons of rock to create a freestanding structure within an excavated courtyard. The scale
and precision of this undertaking demonstrate engineering capabilities and artistic vision that created one of the world's most remarkable architectural achievements. These temple complexes functioned as comprehensive cultural institutions that housed schools, libraries, performance spaces, and workshops alongside religious activities. The integration of education, arts, economic activity, and spiritual practice created environments where knowledge could be preserved and transmitted through multiple generations of political change. The artistic traditions that developed in these temple workshops influenced cultural development far beyond their immediate regions through networks of artistic exchange that connected different kingdoms and cultural centers. Sculptors, architects, and craftsmen traveled between courts, carrying techniques and stylistic innovations that enriched artistic traditions throughout the subcontinent. The prosperity of regional kingdoms during this period resulted from sophisticated economic systems that integrated agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and long-distance trade. Urban centers developed specialized production facilities that supplied both local consumption and export markets with high-quality goods that were valued throughout the known world. The guild system, Shreni, provided institutional frameworks for maintaining quality standards, training craftsmen, and coordinating production with market demands. These organizations balanced competitive innovation with cooperative risk management, creating economic stability that supported both commercial success and cultural patronage. Banking and credit systems developed during this period facilitated long-distance trade despite the risks and uncertainties involved in commercial ventures spanning vast distances and multiple political jurisdictions. The integration of local and international markets created economic networks that generated wealth sufficient to support the monumental architecture and cultural achievements of this remarkable period.
Around the year 1000 CE, the mountain passes that had traditionally protected the Indian subcontinent from large-scale invasion began to witness the emergence of a new kind of threat that would fundamentally alter the course of Indian history. Mahmud of Ghazni, ruling from his fortress capital in Afghanistan, launched the first of 17 systematic raids into northern India, motivated by a potent combination of religious conviction, economic opportunity, and political ambition that represented something unprecedented in its scope and intensity. These initial incursions differed fundamentally from previous foreign invasions that had periodically affected Indian political development. Unlike the Greeks under Alexander, whose presence had been brief and geographically limited, or the Central Asian tribes that had established dynasties like the Kushans while adopting Indian cultural practices, the Ghaznavid forces brought with them a militant interpretation of Islamic religious law that viewed the destruction of Hindu temples not merely as military strategy, but as sacred obligation. The sack of the Somnath Temple in 1025 CE became emblematic of this new form of cultural conflict. The legendary wealth accumulated in this ancient shrine over many centuries, gold, precious stones, elaborate carvings, and religious artifacts, provided enormous economic motivation for continued raiding, while the religious significance of the temple's destruction proclaimed the superiority of Islamic monotheism over Hindu polytheistic practices. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological impact of these raids as profound and lasting. Communities that had developed over centuries without experiencing large-scale external military threats found themselves suddenly vulnerable to forces that not only sought political control, but also explicitly rejected the religious and cultural foundations of Indian civilization. The political fragmentation that had facilitated remarkable regional cultural flowering during the previous centuries, now proved strategically disastrous when confronted with coordinated external threats that transcended traditional patterns of regional warfare. The Rajput kingdoms that had emerged across northern and western India, while individually formidable in their martial traditions and defensive capabilities, proved unable to coordinate effective responses to challenges that required unprecedented levels of military cooperation. The Rajput military system had evolved to address threats from neighboring Indian kingdoms operating according to shared cultural assumptions about the purposes and limitations of warfare. The elaborate codes of honor that governed traditional Indian military conduct, including restrictions on attacking non-combatants, respect for religious sites, and seasonal limitations on campaigning, proved inadequate when confronting enemies who employed different tactical approaches and strategic objectives. The Second Battle of Tarain in 1192 CE represented a crucial turning point where these limitations became tragically apparent. Prithviraj Chauhan, despite commanding forces that included some of the finest warriors in northern India, was decisively defeated by Muhammad of Ghaur's army, which employed coordinated cavalry tactics, systematic archery, and siege techniques that the traditional Indian forces could not effectively counter. The Romantic literature that later celebrated Prithviraj's resistance, while preserving important cultural values about heroism and honor, also reveals the difficulty that Indian military traditions had in adapting to new forms of warfare. The emphasis on individual combat, heroic gestures, and ritualized military encounters that characterized traditional Rajput warfare proved insufficient against enemies who prioritized tactical effectiveness over ceremonial correctness.
Following Muhammad of Ghaur's military victories, his lieutenant, Qutbuddin Aibak, established the first stable Islamic Sultanate in Delhi around 1206 CE, creating the political foundation for what would become over 3 centuries of Islamic rule in northern India. This transition from raiding to permanent occupation required fundamental innovations in governance, as Islamic rulers now faced the complex challenge of maintaining political control over predominantly non-Muslim populations through administrative and legal systems derived from Islamic political theory. The early sultans confronted unprecedented problems in political legitimacy and practical administration. Islamic political theory provided clear guidance for governing Muslim populations, but offered limited precedents for ruling large non-Muslim majorities. The development of policies that could maintain Islamic legal requirements while accommodating the practical necessities of governing diverse populations required creative adaptations that would influence Islamic political thought throughout the medieval period. The jizya tax system, theoretically applied to non-Muslims in exchange for protection and the right to practice their religious traditions, became a crucial mechanism for generating revenue, while providing legal justification for the continuation of Hindu religious and social practices under Islamic political authority. The actual implementation of this system varied significantly across different regions and historical periods, reflecting the ongoing tension between theoretical requirements and practical governmental needs. The construction of mosques using materials from demolished Hindu and Jain temples created powerful symbolic statements about religious and political transformation, while also addressing practical problems of obtaining suitable building materials in unfamiliar architectural environments. The Qutb Minar complex in Delhi exemplifies this process, combining architectural techniques and decorative traditions from multiple cultural sources to create distinctive Indo-Islamic architectural traditions that would influence building styles throughout the medieval period.
The construction of the Qutb Minar complex represented more than mere architectural achievement. It symbolized the establishment of a new civilizational paradigm on Indian soil that would require centuries to reach full development. The mosque, built from the pillars and stones of demolished Hindu and Jain temples, created a powerful visual statement about cultural transformation, while the towering minaret itself, with its unprecedented height and distinctive decorative patterns, announced the arrival of new aesthetic sensibilities that combined Islamic geometric principles with Indian decorative traditions. This architectural synthesis would prove to be one of the most creative aspects of Islamic rule in India, producing building styles that were neither purely Islamic nor purely Indian, but something entirely new. The adaptation of Persian garden design to Indian climatic conditions, the integration of Islamic pointed arches with Indian post and lintel construction techniques, and the development of distinctive regional variations created architectural languages that expressed the cultural complexity of Islamic civilization in Indian environments.
The Mamluk Sultanate, often misleadingly called the Slave Dynasty due to servile origins of some of its founders, established administrative and military institutions between 1206 and 1290 CE that would influence Indian governance for centuries. The Iqta system, adapted from Middle Eastern models, but modified to suit Indian conditions, granted provincial administrators revenue rights from specified territories in exchange for maintaining military forces and administrative services. This feudal arrangement balanced central imperial control with regional autonomy by creating incentives for provincial governors to maintain productive agriculture and efficient administration, while providing the Sultanate with military forces that could be mobilized for imperial campaigns. The system's flexibility allowed adaptation to local conditions while maintaining overall political coordination across vast territories with diverse populations and economic systems. Sultana Razia's remarkable reign from 1236 to 1240 CE challenged fundamental assumptions about political authority and gender roles in both Islamic and Indian societies. Her struggle to maintain power against nobles who rejected female rule illustrated the complex negotiations required when introducing new political concepts into established cultural frameworks. While her administrative competence during her brief reign demonstrated capabilities that transcended conventional gender limitations. The ultimate failure of Razia's experiment in female rule resulted from structural opposition rather than personal inadequacy, revealing the constraints that cultural assumptions could impose on political innovation. Her legacy influenced later discussions about women's political participation while providing historical precedent for female political authority in Islamic contexts. Under Alauddin Khalji, who ruled from 1296 to 1316 CE, the Delhi Sultanate reached its greatest territorial extent through systematic military campaigns that extended Islamic political control deep into peninsular India. Khalji's administrative and military innovations created a more centralized and efficient state apparatus than had previously existed in medieval India, demonstrating possibilities for imperial organization that influenced later political development. The successful defense against Mongol invasions during this period preserved the independence of Indian Islamic kingdoms while demonstrating their military effectiveness against one of the most formidable military forces of the medieval world. The integration of Indian military techniques, particularly the use of war elephants and specialized siege equipment, with Central Asian cavalry tactics and Persian administrative methods, created hybrid military systems specifically adapted to Indian geographical and political conditions. Khalji's market regulation policies, designed to support a large standing army through controlled prices for essential commodities,
represented sophisticated understanding of economic relationships between military power, agricultural production, and urban consumption. These policies required extensive administrative apparatus and constant monitoring, but they enabled military capabilities that could sustain continuous campaigning across vast distances. The systematic use of intelligence networks, diplomatic isolation of enemies, and coordinated military campaigns demonstrated strategic thinking that integrated multiple forms of power, military, economic, administrative, and psychological, in comprehensive approaches to territorial expansion and political consolidation.
The Tughlaq dynasty, particularly under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled from 1325 to 1351 CE, attempted several remarkable administrative experiments that revealed both the possibilities and limitations of medieval state power when applied with systematic determination. The temporary transfer of the capital from Delhi to Dalatabad represented an ambitious attempt to create a more strategically located administrative center, while the introduction of token currency demonstrated sophisticated understanding of monetary theory that anticipated European developments by centuries. The ultimate failure of these experiments illustrated practical constraints facing even the most capable medieval rulers when attempting large-scale social and economic transformation. The massive logistical challenges involved in relocating an entire imperial capital, combined with popular resistance and administrative breakdown, forced the abandonment of policies that might have fundamentally altered Indian political and economic development had they succeeded. Muhammad bin Tughlaq's intellectual curiosity and administrative creativity, while ultimately unsuccessful in their immediate objectives, provided valuable precedents for later rulers attempting similar innovations. His experiments with paper currency, systematic taxation policies, and administrative centralization influenced subsequent approaches to imperial governance throughout the Islamic world. Parallel to political and military developments, the spread of Sufi mystical traditions created alternative pathways for Islamic spiritual and cultural concepts to take root in Indian society. The Chishti Silsila, established by Monjdin Chishti at Ajmer during the 12th century, developed practices that incorporated elements of Indian devotional traditions while maintaining orthodox Islamic theological foundations. The accessibility of Sufi teachings, emphasized through vernacular languages and practices that resonated with existing Indian spiritual sensibilities, facilitated religious conversion among populations who might have remained resistant to more legalistic presentations of Islamic doctrine. The synthesis of Islamic mystical poetry with Indian musical traditions created new forms of devotional expression that influenced both communities while creating shared cultural experiences. Sufi shrines became centers of cultural synthesis, where people from different religious backgrounds could participate in spiritual practices that transcended sectarian boundaries. The development of distinctive Indo-Islamic musical traditions, poetic forms, and devotional practices created cultural common ground that facilitated social integration while preserving religious distinctiveness. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience, ethical conduct, and devotional love in Sufi traditions provided alternatives to both rigid Islamic orthodoxy and elaborate Hindu ritualism, creating middle ground where spiritual seekers could find satisfaction without abandoning their cultural identities entirely. The establishment of Islamic rule in northern India prompted varied responses throughout the subcontinent that ranged from military resistance and cultural withdrawal to selective adaptation and creative synthesis. The Vijayanagara Empire,
founded in 1336 CE as an explicitly Hindu political entity, represented one form of cultural resistance that nonetheless adopted many administrative and military innovations developed by the Islamic sultanates. The founder emperors of Vijayanagara studied Islamic military techniques, administrative systems, and architectural styles, while maintaining Hindu religious and cultural identity, demonstrating possibilities for selective cultural borrowing that preserved essential traditions while adapting to new political and military realities. In Bengal, the independent sultanate that emerged during the 14th century created distinctive forms of Islamic culture that incorporated significant elements of local tradition. The development of Bengali Islamic literature, regional architectural styles, and legal traditions that accommodated local customs demonstrated possibilities for Islamic civilization to adapt to regional conditions while maintaining connections to broader religious and cultural networks.
The integration of northern Indian territories into Islamic trade networks brought unprecedented commercial opportunities, alongside cultural challenges that required creative adaptations from both Muslim and Hindu commercial communities. Indian merchants learned to operate within Islamic legal frameworks governing commerce, while maintaining traditional business practices and social relationships. The development of banking houses capable of facilitating transactions across vast distances, combined with standardized weights, measures, and currency systems, created economic integration that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. Urban centers like Delhi, Lahore, and Multan grew dramatically during this period, attracting craftsmen, scholars, and merchants from throughout the Islamic world, while providing opportunities for Indians to engage with international networks of trade and learning. This urbanization created cosmopolitan environments where cultural synthesis could occur through daily interaction rather than merely elite patronage. The development of mixed neighborhoods, shared commercial practices, and collaborative craft production created social conditions where people from different religious and cultural backgrounds could work together productively while maintaining their distinctive identities. The year 1526 CE marked a fundamental watershed in Indian history when Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, a prince descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, achieved decisive victory over the last sultan of Delhi at the First Battle of Panipat. Babur's triumph represented far more than mere dynastic change. It initiated the Mughal Empire, which would create the most extensive, sophisticated, and culturally creative political system in Indian history, integrating the subcontinent into global networks of trade, culture, and political influence, while fostering unprecedented achievements in architecture, literature, and administrative science. Babur's personal memoirs, the Baburnama, reveal a ruler of remarkable intellectual curiosity, cultural sensitivity, and strategic vision who appreciated India's natural beauty, architectural achievements, and cultural sophistication, despite the military necessities that had brought him there. His decision to establish permanent rule in India, rather than treating it as merely another conquest territory, reflected recognition that the subcontinent offered opportunities for political creativity and cultural achievement that were unavailable elsewhere in the contemporary world. The Mughal military system combined technological innovation with strategic flexibility in ways that created decisive advantages over traditional Indian military organization. The systematic integration of gunpowder weapons, artillery, matchlocks, and improved siege equipment, with mobile cavalry formations and coordinated infantry tactics, created military capabilities that could overcome even the strongest fortress defenses, while maintaining the mobility necessary for rapid territorial expansion.
More fundamentally, Mughal political theory drew from Persian administrative traditions and Islamic legal frameworks, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate Indian political realities and cultural diversity. This synthesis created governmental approaches that could command loyalty from diverse populations across vast territories while maintaining administrative efficiency and cultural creativity.
Babur's son, Humayun, inherited not merely an empire, but the formidable challenge of consolidating Mughal authority against powerful regional opponents who possessed both military capability and legitimate claims to political authority. His temporary loss of the empire to Sher Shah Sur and subsequent 15-year exile in Persia proved ultimately beneficial to Mughal cultural development, as Persian artistic traditions, administrative practices, and intellectual currents became more thoroughly integrated into Mughal court culture through direct contact and systematic study. Sher Shah Sur's brief but highly effective interregnum from 1540 to 1545 CE introduced administrative innovations that the restored Mughals would adopt, expand, and systematize throughout their later territorial expansion. The Grand Trunk Road stretching from Bengal to the Afghan frontier, standardized currency systems, efficient postal communications, and systematic land revenue assessment created infrastructure and institutional foundations that facilitated both political control and commercial development across unprecedented distances. When Humayun regained his throne in 1555 CE, the Mughal court had acquired Persian artistic sensibilities, architectural techniques, and administrative methods that would influence Indian cultural development for centuries. The Persian emphasis on refined court culture, sophisticated literary expression, and integrated artistic programs provided models for cultural patronage that would reach their culmination under later Mughal emperors. The temporary period of non-Mughal rule also demonstrated the attractiveness of efficient, systematic governance to populations that had experienced the benefits of well-organized administration. Sher Shah's popularity among various social groups created expectations for governmental competence that influenced Mughal political development and popular attitudes toward imperial authority. The reign of Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar from 1556 to 1605 CE represented the creative pinnacle of Mughal civilization and one of the most remarkable experiments in multicultural governance in world history. Ascending to the throne at age 13 under extremely difficult circumstances, Akbar gradually developed political, cultural, and religious policies that transformed the Mughal Empire from a conquest state into a genuinely Indian institution capable of commanding voluntary loyalty from diverse populations across religious, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. The abolition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims in 1564 CE represented far more than fiscal policy adjustment. It symbolized Akbar's fundamental commitment to creating political authority that transcended religious distinctions while remaining consistent with Islamic governmental principles. This policy innovation required sophisticated theological justification and careful political management, but it created possibilities for inclusive imperial loyalty that had not previously existed in Islamic political systems. The development of the Mansabdar system allocated military and administrative rank according to demonstrated competence and loyal service rather than birth, religious affiliation, or ethnic background. This meritocratic approach created opportunities for talented individuals from all communities to achieve high positions within the imperial hierarchy, while ensuring that advancement remained dependent on continued service to imperial objectives rather than independent power bases.
Akbar's administrative innovations extended beyond personnel policies to encompass systematic approaches to revenue assessment, judicial procedures, military organization, and cultural patronage that created governmental capabilities exceeding those of any contemporary state. The integration of Rajput military expertise, Persian administrative techniques, and indigenous Indian governmental traditions produced hybrid institutions specifically adapted to Indian conditions while remaining effective across vast territorial expanses.
Akbar's religious innovations, culminating in the promulgation of the Deen-e-Ilahi, or divine faith, around 1582 CE, reflected sophisticated theological thinking about the nature of religious truth and the relationship between spiritual authority and political legitimacy. Drawing inspiration from Islamic, Hindu, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Jain traditions, while remaining grounded in monotheistic principles, this synthetic religion attempted to create spiritual foundations for political unity that could encompass India's extraordinary religious diversity. The weekly discussions held in the Ibadat Khana, house of worship, at Fatehpur Sikri brought together learned representatives of different religious traditions for systematic theological dialogue aimed at identifying common spiritual principles underlying apparent doctrinal differences. These conversations, while never achieving complete theological consensus, demonstrated possibilities for intellectual exchange across religious boundaries that influenced broader cultural attitudes toward religious diversity. Although the Deen-e-Ilahi failed to attract significant popular following and disappeared after Akbar's death, the intellectual framework it represented continued to influence Mughal cultural policy and administrative practices for generations. The principle of sulh-e-kul became a cornerstone of Mughal political theory, advocating tolerance and respect for all religious traditions as partial expressions of underlying spiritual truth that transcended particular sectarian formulations. This theological sophistication provided justification for policies that balanced Islamic governmental requirements with practical necessities of governing religiously diverse populations, creating precedents that influenced Islamic political thought throughout the medieval period and beyond. Under Jahangir, who ruled from 1605 to 1627 CE, Mughal court culture achieved unprecedented refinement in artistic achievement, intellectual sophistication, and cultural integration that created synthetic traditions combining the finest elements from multiple civilizational sources. The emperor's personal passion for natural history, miniature painting, and Persian poetry created court environments where artistic creativity could flourish under systematic patronage while maintaining connections to broader cultural traditions. The development of Mughal miniature painting during this period represented one of the world's great artistic achievements, synthesizing Persian compositional principles with Indian naturalistic observation and European perspective techniques to create distinctive styles that influenced artistic development throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The detailed documentation of flora, fauna, court ceremonies, and daily life in these paintings provides unparalleled insight into Mughal society, while demonstrating artistic capabilities that combined technical mastery with profound aesthetic sensibility.
Jahangir's systematic patronage of poets, musicians, architects, and craftsmen created competitive environments where artistic innovation could flourish while maintaining standards of excellence that attracted talent from throughout the known world. The court workshops that produced textiles, jewelry, weapons, and decorative objects achieved levels of craftsmanship that made Mughal goods highly valued in international markets from Europe to Southeast Asia. The emperor's personal interests in scientific observation and systematic documentation encouraged detailed studies of natural phenomena that combined aesthetic appreciation with scientific curiosity in ways that influenced later intellectual development.
The reign of Shah Jahan, from 1628 to 1658 CE, witnessed the culmination of Mughal architectural achievement and urban planning that created some of the most beautiful and technically sophisticated buildings in world history. The construction of the Taj Mahal, while representing the most famous example of Mughal architecture, was merely one element in a comprehensive program of architectural development that transformed cities throughout the empire and established aesthetic principles that influenced building design for centuries. The Taj Mahal itself demonstrates the extraordinary level of technical skill, artistic vision, and organizational capability that Mughal architects and craftsmen had achieved by the mid-17th century. The mathematical precision of its proportions, the sophisticated integration of structural and decorative elements, and the successful creation of architectural space that induces specific emotional and spiritual responses represent achievements that required centuries of accumulated knowledge and exceptional individual creativity. The new city of Shahjahanabad, Old Delhi, with its planned boulevards, integrated residential and commercial districts, systematic water supply, and magnificent fort-palace complex, represented urban design principles that influenced city planning throughout the Islamic world and demonstrated capabilities for large-scale environmental organization that rivaled any contemporary achievement worldwide. The integration of Persian garden design with Indian climatic conditions created architectural environments that combined aesthetic beauty with practical functionality, producing buildings and landscapes that served both ceremonial and residential purposes while maintaining visual harmony that expressed imperial power through beauty rather than mere grandeur. The Mughal Empire during its peak period created the most extensive integrated economy in Indian history, with standardized currency, uniform legal frameworks for commercial activity, and systematic transportation networks that facilitated trade across unprecedented distances and cultural boundaries. The empire's integration into global commercial networks brought American silver through European and Middle Eastern intermediaries, while Indian textiles, spices, precious stones, and manufactured goods reached markets from Southeast Asia to Western Europe. The famous Mughal textile industry, centered in Bengal, Gujarat, and other specialized production regions, created cotton and silk fabrics whose quality, design sophistication, and technical innovation influenced fashion and decorative arts throughout the known world. European trading companies' establishment of factories and trading posts along Indian coasts represented the beginning of more intensive commercial relationships, though during this period these arrangements remained largely favorable to Indian economic interests. The systematic organization of craft production in imperial workshops, combined with extensive networks of independent artisans and merchant communities, created economic complexity that generated the wealth necessary to support monumental architecture, extensive administrative systems, and cultural patronage that sustained artistic and intellectual achievement throughout the empire.
agricultural productivity improvements through irrigation projects, crop diversification, and systematic land revenue administration created rural prosperity that supported both urban development and imperial resources while maintaining population growth and territorial expansion capabilities.
The extraordinarily long reign of Aurangzeb, from 1658 to 1707 CE, marked both the territorial zenith of Mughal power and the beginning of internal transformations that would ultimately contribute to imperial decline. His conquest of the remaining Deccan kingdoms extended Mughal authority throughout most of the Indian subcontinent, creating an empire larger and more populous than any previous Indian state, while also creating administrative and military challenges that strained even Mughal organizational capabilities. Aurangzeb's religious policies represented a fundamental departure from the tolerant synthesis developed by his predecessors, reflecting both personal conviction and strategic calculation about the requirements for governing an overwhelmingly Muslim military establishment across predominantly Hindu territories. The reimposition of the jizya tax, the destruction of selected Hindu temples, and systematic preference from Muslim officials in government positions created religious tensions that undermined the inclusive political loyalty that Akbar had successfully cultivated among diverse populations. The prolonged Deccan campaigns that occupied the final decades of Aurangzeb's reign demonstrated both Mughal military capabilities and the limitations of imperial expansion when confronting determined regional resistance supported by difficult terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics. The enormous costs of continuous military operations, combined with the administrative challenges of governing newly conquered territories, strained imperial resources while generating political opposition that would outlast Aurangzeb's lifetime. The emergence of Maratha power under Shivaji represented a fundamentally new form of resistance to Mughal authority that combined military innovation with cultural nationalism and regional loyalty in ways that created ideological challenges transcending mere territorial competition. Shivaji's development of guerrilla warfare techniques adapted to the Western Ghats' mountainous terrain, created military problems that Mughal armies, designed for conventional warfare and siege operations, could not solve through traditional strategic approaches. More significantly, Shivaji's explicit appeal to Hindu cultural identity and Marathi regional pride created forms of political loyalty that could not be purchased through administrative incorporation or neutralized through military defeat alone. The establishment of an independent Maratha kingdom represented the first successful assertion of non-Muslim political authority in northern India since the early centuries of Islamic rule, providing precedents and inspiration for other regional movements. The administrative and military innovations developed by Maratha leaders, including systematic revenue collection, coordinated cavalry operations, and alliance networks that balanced local autonomy with strategic cooperation, created governmental capabilities that would influence Indian political development long after Mughal decline, while demonstrating alternative approaches to territorial organization and cultural integration. Despite the political difficulties that emerged during Aurangzeb's later years, the Mughal administrative system, cultural achievements, and approaches to governing diverse populations created institutional foundations that would influence Indian civilization for centuries beyond the empire's political authority. The systematic organization of military and civilian hierarchies, the development of legal frameworks that could accommodate religious diversity, and the creation of cultural traditions that synthesized influences from throughout the known world, provided models and precedents that shaped subsequent political development. The Mughal court's patronage of literature, music, painting, and architecture created cultural traditions that continued to influence Indian artistic development into the modern period and beyond. The synthesis of Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Indian cultural elements produced new forms of artistic expression that transcended their constituent influences while remaining distinctively Indian in their final development. As our long journey through the civilizations of ancient India draws toward its close, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of yet another great transformation in human history. The year 1707, marking the death of Aurangzeb and the beginning of Mughal fragmentation, would soon witness the gradual emergence of new players on the Indian stage. European trading companies whose initial commercial interests would slowly evolve into political influence, ultimately ushering in colonial periods that would again reshape the subcontinent's destiny in fundamental ways. Yet even as political structures rose and fell across these 4 millennia, certain essential characteristics of Indian civilization displayed remarkable continuity that transcended particular dynasties, religions, or cultural movements. The spiritual seeking that began in Vedic forest retreats continued through Buddhist monasteries, Jain temples, Sufi khanqahs, and Hindu ashrams, creating unbroken traditions of philosophical inquiry that questioned the nature of reality, consciousness, and human purpose across every historical period we have explored. The mathematical insights that emerged from Vedic ritual geometry evolved through classical astronomical observations and medieval algebraic innovations to influence scholarly communities throughout the world, while the artistic sensibilities first expressed in Indus Valley seals flowered through Mauryan sculpture, Gupta temple carvings, Chola bronzes, and Mughal miniature paintings, creating aesthetic traditions that combined technical mastery with spiritual depth across centuries of cultural development.
Perhaps most remarkably, the extraordinary capacity for cultural synthesis that allowed Indian civilization to absorb and creatively transform influences from Greeks, Scythians, Kushans, Arabs, Turks, Afghans, Mongols, and Persians, while maintaining distinctive cultural identity, would prove equally capable of engaging with European ideas and technologies when those encounters intensified in subsequent centuries. The intellectual curiosity that led ancient Indian thinkers to develop systematic approaches to consciousness, mathematics, medicine, and governance created foundations for adaptation and innovation that would continue influencing human development far beyond the geographical boundaries of the subcontinent itself. The political experiments we have traced, from Ashoka's dharmic governance through Akbar's religious synthesis, established precedents for inclusive authority that could accommodate extraordinary diversity while maintaining effective unity. These achievements provided models for addressing challenges that remain relevant to contemporary political development: how to balance local autonomy with broader coordination, how to maintain cultural distinctiveness within larger political frameworks, and how to create governmental legitimacy that transcends particular religious or ethnic identities.
The economic networks that connected Indian merchants and craftsmen to markets extending from Rome to Southeast Asia had created commercial sophistication, technological innovation, and organizational capabilities that would facilitate engagement with emerging global economic systems while preserving essential cultural values and social structures that had supported Indian civilization across millennia of historical change. Most profoundly, the spiritual and philosophical traditions that had emerged from Indian cultural development, the various forms of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the distinctive varieties of Islamic mysticism that had taken root in Indian conditions, had developed approaches to fundamental questions about consciousness, ethics, and liberation that would continue offering guidance to seekers regardless of changing political circumstances or technological developments. The understanding that ultimate reality transcends temporary political forms, that spiritual truth manifests through diverse cultural expressions, and that genuine liberation requires both ethical conduct and systematic mental cultivation remained as relevant to future generations as to the ancient sages who first articulated these insights through careful investigation and direct spiritual experience. As we reflect on the vast sweep of Indian history from the Indus Valley cities through the Mughal Empire, certain recurring themes emerge with remarkable consistency across different periods and cultural contexts. The creative tension between worldly engagement and spiritual transcendence, evident in the ashrama system's recognition that different life phases require different priorities and practices. The balance between local cultural identity and universal spiritual principles demonstrated through the ways regional traditions maintained distinctiveness while participating in broader networks of learning and religious practice.
The synthesis of practical knowledge with spiritual insight, visible in mathematical and astronomical achievements motivated by both ritualistic requirements and contemplative purposes, and the integration of artistic beauty with religious meaning, expressed through architectural traditions that created environments designed to facilitate spiritual experience through aesthetic appreciation and symbolic comprehension. The story we have traced represents more than historical sequence. It embodies humanity's ongoing experiment in creating meaningful civilization that could balance individual fulfillment with collective welfare, material prosperity with spiritual development, cultural preservation with adaptive innovation, and local identity with universal values. The questions confronted by ancient Indian thinkers, how to organize society in ways that promoted both justice and prosperity, how to understand the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality, how to balance material advancement with spiritual growth, how to govern diverse populations while respecting their cultural differences, remain as pressing today as they were 4,000 years ago, when the first planned cities arose beside the Indus River. The solutions developed in response to these enduring challenges, while necessarily adapted to specific historical circumstances, continue offering insights for contemporary consideration. The recognition that political authority requires moral legitimacy, that economic prosperity should serve human flourishing rather than mere material accumulation, that intellectual achievement finds its highest purpose in contributing to the reduction of suffering and the promotion of wisdom. These principles transcend their historical origins to provide guidance for ongoing human development. The physical monuments of this extraordinary civilization, from the precise urban planning of Harappa through the mathematical elegance of classical temple architecture to the aesthetic refinement of Mughal gardens and palaces, continue inspiring wonder and admiration among contemporary visitors. But perhaps more importantly, the intellectual, artistic, and spiritual achievements preserved in literature, philosophy, and living traditions continue offering practical wisdom for addressing fundamental questions about human existence and social organization.
As the monsoon rains continue their ancient cycle, as the great rivers flow eternally from Himalayan glaciers to nourish the fertile plains below, as seekers continue gathering in ashrams, universities, and meditation centers to pursue understanding and liberation, the essential spirit of Indian civilization persists. The specific forms may change. Political systems evolve, technologies advance, social structures adapt to new circumstances, but the underlying commitment to inquiry, synthesis, and the conviction that human consciousness can transcend ignorance and suffering to achieve wisdom and compassion remains constant across all transformations. This continuity represents not mere preservation of ancient traditions, but the maintenance of essential insights that enable creative adaptation to changing circumstances. Like the great banyan tree, whose aerial roots create new trunks while drawing nourishment from ancient sources, Indian civilization demonstrates the possibility of preserving core values while embracing beneficial innovations, maintaining spiritual wisdom while engaging practical challenges, and honoring traditional knowledge while remaining open to new discoveries. The story we have told continues unfolding in countless contemporary lives, in scholars studying ancient texts, in artists creating new forms of beauty, in spiritual practitioners following paths mapped by earlier seekers, in scientists building upon mathematical and logical insights developed over millennia, and in ordinary people striving to live with wisdom, compassion, and dignity amid the eternal challenges of human existence. As our journey through ancient India reaches its conclusion, we are left not with final answers, but with enduring invitations to continue the inquiry that began with those first philosophers who wondered about the nature of existence, to carry forward the artistic vision that seeks truth through beauty, to embody the social idealism that envisions justice and compassion as practical possibilities rather than mere dreams, and to pursue the spiritual development that recognizes individual liberation and collective welfare as intimately connected aspects of a single great work.